If you want to dominate the battlefield, you'll need the right spells, and that's exactly what we're here to break down. In this video, we're ranking every spell in Wizard West from best to worst, helping you figure out which ones will make you unstoppable and which ones might just be a waste of mana. Some spells can turn the tide of battle in an instant, while others might leave you wondering why they even exist. Whether you're dueling enemies or taking on tough PvE fights, knowing which spells to use is key to becoming a true magical gunslinger. Before we dive into the rankings, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more Wizard West guides, tier lists, and tips to keep you ahead of the competition. Now, let's get into the rankings and see which spells stand at the top of the magical Wild West. D tier, the weakest and most useless spells. D tier spells in Wizard West are either completely outclassed, impractical, or nearly useless in combat. These spells should be avoided unless you have no other options. Bolt fires small tracking bolts that deal decent damage and have a short cooldown. However, its long channel time and early game limitations make it a weak choice compared to better offensive spells. Lumo, essentially just a light spell. If you ever wanted to recreate Gandalf's staff glow in the mines of Moria, this is your chance, though in Wizard West, it serves almost no practical purpose. Completely useless. Matrificius emits a few sparks from your wand, briefly stunning nearby enemies. The tiny range, low damage, and existence of much better stun spells make this one of the worst choices in the game. Revelio reveals nearby objects and creatures. While this might be useful in a tabletop RPG, it has no real application in Wizard West. It's completely unnecessary and a waste of a spell slot. Vocare Pickaxe, a tool spell that summons a pickaxe for gathering resources. Since this tier list focuses on combat effectiveness, this spell is at the absolute bottom. It's fine for resource farming, but in battle, it's completely useless. D-tier spells offer almost no value in combat and should be skipped in favor of more effective choices. Now that we've ranked all the spells in Wizard West, let's wrap up with a final conclusion and some recommendations on which spells to prioritize. C-tier, underwhelming and situational spells. C-tier spells in Wizard West are either too weak, too situational, or outclassed by better options. While they might have some niche uses, they're generally not worth using over higher tier spells. Episkio, a basic self-healing spell that lacks AoE healing. Since it only benefits you and not your allies, it's often better to take a stronger damage-dealing spell instead. Episkios, a healing bolt that moderately restores an ally's HP. While it's fun to use, it's highly situational and not nearly as effective as an AoE healing spell. Expulso, disarming opponents can be useful in PvP, but stuns are generally more effective. In PvE, this spell is almost completely useless, making it a weak choice overall. Haste, boosting your movement and casting speed sounds great, but the duration is too short to make a real impact. If the buff lasted longer, it could be A tier, but in its current state, it's not worth taking over stronger spells. Ignis, a small AoE fire spell with low damage, awkward aiming, and poor PvP potential. It's only useful in the earliest stages of the game, but even then, there are better options. Stupendo, a mix between Lasso and an auto-tracking stun bolt. While that sounds great, the short duration and its limited effectiveness against low HP enemies make it a disappointing pick. Vocare summons armor that can be useful in PvP, but it lacks value in PvE. Since Protego is a more reliable defensive option, this spell rarely sees use. Vocare Halberta, a melee-based summoning spell that could have been great with better range, more attacks, or higher damage. Unfortunately, in its current form, it's weak compared to other weapon-based spells. C-tier spells aren't entirely useless, but they require too many conditions to be effective. Most of them are outclassed by stronger alternatives, making them poor choices for serious Wizard West players. Now, let's move on to the D-tier spells, which are the weakest in the game. B-tier, decent but situational spells. B-tier spells in Wizard West are solid but come with noticeable drawbacks. They can still be useful in the right situations, but they're either outclassed by better spells or require specific conditions to shine. Aquarcia, a basic early game spell with low damage and mild enemy entrapment. It's not the strongest control spell, but its fast cooldown makes it a decent choice when you need quick crowd control. Diffindo fires a horizontal piercing bolt that can hit multiple enemies at once. The short cooldown and long range are great, but it requires precise aim, making it less forgiving than other spells. Electrificus, a small lightning bolt with lower damage and a small AoE. However, its ability to ragdoll enemies makes it useful for disrupting opponents in both PvE and PvP fights. Episkio Magna, the best healing spell in the game, restoring health to both you and nearby allies. The main downside is that it takes up a valuable spell slot that could be used for more offensive options. Glacius fires a small tracking bolt that applies the chill effect, slowing down enemies. While the damage is minimal, it has auto-tracking, a fast cooldown, and decent utility for slowing enemies down. Ignisio, a short-range, cone-shaped burst of fire that deals decent AoE damage. It's effective against groups of enemies but limited by its small range. Ignisium, often called a weaker version of Bombarda, this fireball spell deals moderate damage but makes up for it with a large area of effect. Any enemies caught in the blast radius will also be set on fire, adding some extra damage over time. Enlisus calls down a lightning strike that stuns nearby enemies. While it has a solid AoE effect, its damage output is low, and it requires precise targeting, making it less reliable than other spells. B-tier spells can be effective, but they usually require good aim, strategic positioning, or specific scenarios to be worth using. They're not bad, but they don't quite match the raw power or versatility of higher-tier spells. Next, let's move on to the C-tier spells, which have even more noticeable drawbacks. A-tier, powerful and reliable spells. A-tier spells are strong and highly effective, but they fall just short of being overpowered. These spells offer great utility, damage, and control, making them excellent choices for both PvP and PvE. Apparate, a top-tier utility spell that lets you teleport anywhere on the map for free. This is perfect for repositioning in battle, escaping dangerous situations, or ambushing opponents. Bombarda, nothing beats the thrill of dropping a massive bomb on your enemies. While aiming can be tricky at first, the initial explosion followed by a series of smaller blasts makes this spell well worth mastering. Frigidus creates a freezing vortex that immobilizes enemies in a wide area. With its large AoE, long duration, and short cooldown, this spell is a favorite in both PvP and PvE. Freezing your enemies in place makes them easy targets for follow-up attacks. Glacilancia fires multiple ice spikes that track enemies, though the accuracy isn't great. It's very effective against single targets but struggles against groups. Best used in one-on-one fights where precision isn't as crucial. Protego, one of the best defensive spells for PvP. This creates a durable barrier that blocks incoming spells and has a relatively short cooldown, making it a great option for players who like to play defensively and counterattack. Oceanus Vortico summons powerful waves that trap enemies in bubbles, making it an excellent crowd control spell. Once trapped, enemies are easy to eliminate or give you time to reset cooldowns. Works well in both PvP and PvE. Vocare Enarma summons a rifle that fires explosive bullets. With high damage, long range, and fast projectile speed, this spell is deadly in skilled hands. However, it requires precise aiming to be effective. Vocare Machinam, a machine gun variation of Vocare Enarma, offering rapid-fire damage with great range and speed. Like its counterpart, it requires good accuracy to make full use of its potential. A-tier spells are some of the most reliable in Wizard West, offering a balance of damage, control, and defense. They may not be as broken as S-tier spells, but they can still carry you to victory. Now, let's move on to the B-tier spells, which are solid but come with a few weaknesses. S-tier, the best spells in Wizard West. S-tier spells are the absolute best in Wizard West, offering game-changing abilities that can turn the tide of battle. These spells provide insane damage, powerful crowd control, and strategic advantages that make them essential for any top-tier wizard. Abra Kedabra, the most lethal spell in the game, capable of taking down enemies in a single strike. It's an absolute menace in PvP, making it one of the most feared spells in Wizard West. Sure, the name might be a little cringy, but there's no denying its power. Tempestia Incarnata, a devastating AoE spell that deals massive damage to multiple enemies at once. It can track multiple targets, making it extremely effective for clearing groups of enemies and controlling the battlefield. Lasso, you wouldn't expect this early game spell to be S tier, but Lasso is one of the most broken spells, especially in PvP. It immobilizes opponents, setting them up for an easy elimination. Some players even consider it overpowered due to how effective it is at shutting down enemies. Imperum, a powerful control spell that temporarily forces an enemy to fight on your side. It's incredibly useful in situations where you're outnumbered, turning the strength of your opponents against them. Morsmortem, need backup? Morsmortem summons 3 shadow wizards to fight alongside you. The cooldown is long, but the sheer power of having extra allies in battle makes it one of the most useful spells in tough fights. These S-tier spells dominate both PvE and PvP, making them the best choices for any serious Wizard West player. Now, let's move on to the A-tier spells, which are still strong but not quite as overpowered as these.